So the second part of our discussion on policy as design. We've tried to establish a theoretical framework for studying design as policy in the first part of the discussion, and the second part now seeks to apply those hypotheses or that framework to a case study of design as policy in the form of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or MGNREGA, or NREGA simply briefly, which is a law for providing work to the rural poor. We will examine a set of issues here. What was the normative design? What is the context and problem mapping? What was the problem statement? What change was intended? What was the design solution? The implementation process? The design innovations, of any, and then a design appraisal of whether there were inconsistencies. If you recall, we talked about instrumentation in the first part of our discussion, and whether the instruments chosen for delivering the design solution and achieving the design intent and the act were indeed successful. Did they settle the problem they set out to address, or has something remained uncertain? NREGA is shaped by the values of distributive justice and equity, formulated as a right to work. So this is a normative design of NREGA. The values informing it are both intrinsic and instrumental. The right to work has intrinsic value because jobs provide basic protection, self-reliance, and dignity, and they also have instrumental value because they enhance purchasing power and growth. The values here articulated derive from the Constitution of India, Part 4, Directive Principles. In particular, citizens should have the right to an adequate means of livelihood, and there should be equal pay for equal work. Further, that the state should make an effort for securing the right to work, and then we read these directive principles in the fundamental Article 21, the right to life, and we note through a series of Supreme Court judgments that the right to life actually subsumes within it the right to health and livelihood. Politically, these values were articulated when the United Progressive Alliance formed a coalition government at the center in 2004 and formulated the National Common Minimum Program to enact a National Employment Guarantee Act to provide a legal guarantee for at least 100 days of employment in a year on minimum wages on asset-creating public works. So here's an instance of political ideology joining in with values given in the Constitution and supported by social activists who had also been agitating for the right to work. The design questions at this juncture of formulating the issues and the possible direction for a solution to be shaped were actually looking at who were the people without access to adequate means of livelihood and the scope of this problem, and then that would determine who would the target user be and what was to be achieved, and an analysis of existing policies and designing some changes to be introduced, and all that to be determined within a framework of available resources and time. The exploration of the problem or diagnosing the problem rested on government surveys like those done by the National Sample Survey Organization, or NSSO, and the annual economic surveys, which identified issues, the main issue being poverty and unemployment. And these were documented in the Planning Commission, which noted that almost 300 million people were poor or below the poverty line. This large part of this belonged to the agricultural labor, and that because their numbers were rising and the size of land holdings was decreasing, and all of this led to the unemployment rate of agricultural households rising. And all this creates a scenario of vulnerable rural communities. We use the word vulnerability here to indicate the tendency of people or groups of people to be adversely affected by environmental, economic, and social factors because they already lack resources. So their coping strength is very low. And therefore, these 27% of the population living below the poverty line, or the threshold of subsistence below which would be very chronic and dire situation of deprivation, that these people were vulnerable, and they are vulnerable to either adverse weather or the consequences of adverse weather events, because these would affect their livelihood base. And this is because most agriculture in India is rain-fed, and because of erratic rainfall, there is low agricultural productivity and low agricultural income. And this traps rural poor in a vicious cycle of dependencies. Low wages make it difficult for them to access a basic basket of consumption. Please recall we talked about below poverty line, and not having access to a basic basket of consumption resources pushes you below that level. A poor resource base results in poor assets. Then in addition are the and poor skills. Then environmental degradation erodes the very basis of the rural livelihoods and increases risks. That means all of these are actually contributing to aggravating vulnerabilities of the rural poor. Then all this leads to a death cycle and distress migration, and the ones who are especially adversely impacted are landless agricultural labor, marginal and small farmers. While stabilizing agriculture growth and the trickle-down effect of economy takes time, it was very clear that the rural poor, especially the agricultural labor and small and marginal farmers, need immediate relief. And this is a historically continuing situation. This is not something which has been suddenly mapped, when a new government came to power. And that relates to the earlier point we made about the historical continuum of issues when you are designing policy. It's not just a thing that has just come up and needs to be addressed in a finite time. It's a historical process, and the effort to solve problems that are situated in a historical time continuum will make use of data which has been there, available over a long period of time. So the study of this kind of trends, which is really indicative of distress to rural economy and to agricultural labor in particular, was to frame a potential solution. In this, again, we refer to the historical knowledge of what we call wage employment programs. These are direct transfers of benefits to the client. And we can contrast them with indirect interventions where, for example, you first have to skill people and then they have to find jobs, and the jobs are only available because there is a market and a demand for it. So that's a longer cycle. It's an indirect cycle. It takes time because more factors are involved in getting the solution in place. But while those kind of factors or market-led economic growth would need to unfold itself over a period of time, immediate relief had to be given to those who were in chronic poverty or severely distressed. So India has had a long history of wage employment programs, and these were studied because they offer immediate relief, productive employment, durable and rural infrastructure, food security, and they also exercise an upward pressure on market wages. So we had an existing design, the wage employment program as it was known as, or as they are known as. And then these are analyzed to see what the limitations were, that they had limited outreach and mainly on account of inadequate budget and poor planning. And the problem statement consisted of this kind of a review analysis and a decision that perhaps a wage employment program would be a feasible solution because it would also help us focus on root causes of stagnant agriculture. So a pilot solution in the nature of the National Food for Work program was formulated in 150 districts identified for low productivity, being drought prone and having low wages and a large portion of SC/ST population. The emphasis on this pilot program was on emphasis on works which related to water, afforestation, rural connectivity. These are labor intensive with no contractors. But then only after maybe even perhaps just about a year or less, reviews revealed that the NFWP had really got all the flaws of earlier wage employment programs and was not helping resolve the problem at hand. And in fact, it was really not much of a pilot because the design was quite different from the one that had to be conceptualized to address the limitation of the earlier program. So The other existing design alternative was the Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Scheme, or the MEGS, which was a design based on the workers' demand for work. And that was quite different from the NFFWP, which was supposed to be the pilot for NREGA. Of course, so that led to the formulation of the NREGA bill, and after much debate and discussion, and an unfair amount of conflicting viewpoints both within the government, between finance and the rural development department, and the civil society activists. Everybody had a different point of view, and the eventual bill was passed on September 7, 2005, and became operational as a program from 2006 February. And the policy form, or the design form for NREGA, is an interesting one because it's a law which subsumes a policy and a program. So if you recall our discussion on the typologies of policies, we said that could be regulatory or promotive, and both. So NREGA is an example of a policy whose typology is both promotive and regulatory. It's promotive because it's protective of the interests of the poor. It's developmental because it hopes that the investments lead to growth, and it's also regulatory because it's an act that enjoins obligations with penalties and also grants rights. So the design intent was the inclusion of the poor to promote equity, improve ecology and economy. So it was an act to provide for the enhancement of livelihood security of households in rural areas by providing at least 100 days of guaranteed employment every financial year to every household whose adult members volunteer to do unskilled manual work. And here the point I want to make is that this statement, this design intent, this is a substantive instrumentation. It's an example of substantive instrumentation because it defines policy goals. The policy goals being a solution to rural distress, and that solution takes the form of unskilled manual labor. Now, if the design intent was to have an inclusive growth, then what this act seeks to do is to combine social protection with progressive resilience, and to do that through the instrumental right to work. So the goals are social protection, ladder of progressive resilience, and those are the goals. But the method to do that is the right to work. So the right to work becomes, interestingly enough, both an instrument as well as a goal. I mean, the goal is to be able to give everybody the right to work. But within this program, the way the wage employment program has been designed is by invoking a right to work. So you ask for a right to work, and that becomes your tool, and what you achieve through that is also a normative goal. Just to point out that social protection is a universal value, and it has led to governments designing programs and policies to reduce poverty and vulnerability, and by reducing people's exposure to risks and enhancing their own capacity to manage those risks. So this is a sustainable development goal as well, and it hopes to promote greater equality. Resilience is the ability to anticipate, prepare, and respond to hazardous events, trends, or disturbances, and the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. The International Labour Organization has a diagrammatic representation of social protection, a social security staircase, and looks at a variety of measures which are contributive to social security. Worldwide, governments have engaged in designing social protection programs in terms of conditional transfers, unconditional transfers in the form of cash, or conditionalities, and this itself is a huge universe for studying design of social protection programs as policies. NREGA, of course, has been unique in this universe of social protection programs because it's framed like a law, and that gives it its very distinctive character and also the international interest that it arouses. The framework of design thinking underlying NREGA to leverage a wage employment program towards progressive and sustainable resilience has been briefly indicated here. So, beginning at a very subsistent level of benefit, you can move on through a medium to a longer term impact. So, you can move from subsistence to more productivity to the ability to invest and diversify and then make informed choices. And these happen over a time scale from immediate to medium to long term. And they nudge the worker, the beneficiary in NREGA, from a layer of protection to being to a higher layer where you can prevent crises and distresses, and then from order where you can actually have the ability to save and grow. So you move from just the coping ability, which is like that of a safety net, to adaptation and increased savings and a larger basket of consumption, to savings and growth, and then to be able to improve the quality of your life. So that's a level where you can be said to be at a level of transformational change, because you can now take control of your actions, and your dependencies on the environment around you are more in your control and in your ability to negotiate. Just wanted to make clear that this is a kind of design thinking, and this is not an input-output relationship here. It's not that you will find instances of this all over in NREGA. It's just that this is the kind of thinking that underlies the decisions that NREGA encourages its policymakers or those who implement the program to take. The design questions raised to give effect to this design intent are about 12, and we will deal with them as we go on from one to the other. And these really consist of an analysis of the instruments that were deployed in the NREGA design to move the intent towards implementation and solutions. The substantive instrumentation can be represented like an integrated relationship between three nodes of inclusion. We recall we said that the aim of NREGA is inclusive growth. It seeks to promote the workers' employment opportunities, but in a manner that promotes the ecology and the economy. Those three E's have to be brought together, and they're brought together through the three W's: the worker, the wages, and the work. The worker gets work, so that promotes employment. The work is given on something that relates to natural resource management. The task relates to natural resources management, and whether it's on public land or in individual land. And so the nature of work is such that it regenerates the ecology. It earns the worker wages. So that's in the core design in NREGA is this integrated relationship with three nodes of inclusion: worker, work, and wages. And this integration of the worker, wages, and work spins off results that regenerate ecology, promote equity, and give a stimulus to the economy. So the three goals of economic growth, of ecological regeneration, and greater equity are promoted by the design that integrates the worker with the wages, with the work. And that relationship sets off and determines the set of instruments that define the design of the whole act. So now we look at design question 1, and these few questions all relate to the worker, and you have to keep that worker wages work relationship in our mind to delve into the design of this policy. So the first question that NREGA raises is, how do you target the right user? The guarantee is universal. Anyone living in a rural area can apply for work under NREGA. There is no pre-qualifying criteria in terms of economic means or education or skills. But there are filters which have been built into the design itself. One of them is the fact that work is offered includes hard manual labor and is on subsistence wages. And these two filters actually exclude the possibility of rich people applying for work under NREGA. And only those who are used to hard manual labor and need this work, like the poor, the landless labor, or small marginal farmers, they would be encouraged to apply. Most studies that relate to NREGA have shown that this indeed has been the case, and the program has not been hijacked by the rich. The second design question is also worker related. How do you ensure that 1/3 of the people who are participating are women? This is part of substantive instrumentation because it defines a policy goal of inclusive growth and equity. One aspect of equity is including poor people into the realm of work, and the other aspect of equity is that among the poor people giving preference to women. So gender is another dimension of equity. And these all tell us how the beneficiaries can also be categorized in the different categories, and that is actually part of fine-tuning the instruments of design and to be able to reach to the targeted beneficiary. The problem here was the cultural rule patriarchy in which women are situated, and that frowns upon their working in public spaces. The solution was also found by a very intelligent instrument set. First of all, work is to be offered locally, so NREGA work has to be within 5 kilometers of local residence. Then flexible participation, women can enroll, drop in, drop out of work. There are worksite facilities like the creche, but most importantly, the wage parity. Men and women are paid the same amount for the same kind of work. And this has been groundbreaking actually, because while there have been considerable wage disparities among men and women in other programs, there are no such discriminations in NREGA. This is an NSSO survey, round 64th finding. And all of this have ensured that the percentage of women participating in NREGA is actually much above 50%. So here, NREGA has proved to be a very effective design solution. Question number 3 is also related to the workers. How can they get work when they need? This response to this question is through procedural instrumentation. We recall that as being a fixed sequence of causally connected activities with consequential results. And here is also an example of how the institutional structure and formal documents and formally laid down steps and process interplay with each other to create a design. The design sought to be created here is a relationship between a demand process by the worker and a guarantee response by the Gram Panchayat. So there are a number of steps and a number of formal documents involved in this. The potential worker has to register at the Gram Panchayat, and that is acknowledged through the issuing of a job card. The job card can be given to anybody who's a resident in the local Gram Panchayat. And then, based on that job card, the worker is to submit a work application to the Gram Panchayat. Initially, this had to be in a written form, but because workers are not literate, this was later amended to allow workers to make oral applications as well. This is also an instance of practice slipping back into policy redesign to make the design instrument fit the client or the worker in this case. The response to this demand is by the institutional structure or the Gram Panchayat here that issues a formal document or a dated receipt, and that then has to offer work to the worker within a time limit of 15 days. And once the work is complete, has to pay wages, and that too within 15 days. So this whole design is defined by formal documents, the interplay between the client or the worker and the institutional structure responsible for implementing the act. Design question 4 relates to the NREGA wages and the wage rate. The first question was how to fix the NREGA wage rate. The problem here is that, and this is a problem for most wage employment programs that are in the form of social protection, is that if you fix the wage rate very low, below what we call a social safety net, that defines a kind of a threshold below which if you sink, then you will sink into chronic poverty, and so it's not tenable as a social safety net, it breaks. So if you fix the wage rate very low, and then it can fall through the social safety net, and if that net breaks, then the whole purpose of the social protection program is lost. But if you fix the wage rate very high and much above the prevalent wage rates, which could be comparable, then that can also upset the market dynamics, because wage employment programs are in policy parlance called the employment of last resort. I mean, the state becomes an employer because there is no other employer available in the market. But if the state, as an employer, starts offering very high wage rates, then those who are meant to be benefiting from this program like a social protection cover, would there not be nudged towards seeking employment in the market, and then that whole balance between social protection and market would break again. So now this dilemma on where to fix the wage rate has been sought to be addressed in NGNREGA through creating an index which links the NGNREGA wage rate to the consumer price index for agricultural labor. The consumer price index for agricultural labor is a way of measuring the effects of inflation on the purchasing power of a reference group, and that helps you to determine a feasible wage rate for that particular group of consumers, in this case the agricultural labor. And because this is revised annually, it helps to peg the NGNREGA wage rate at a certain level, which would prevent the worker from slipping below the social safety net as a threshold, but would also not be so high as to push the wages artificially upwards without commensurate work being done, or disturbing the market dynamics. So this is another example of how there's been a design fit between the instrument, the problem, and the solution. And this is quite an innovation, because in previous programs, the wage rates were linked with minimum wages prevalent in different states for the agricultural labor. This is like unskilled manual labor. But that posed a lot of problem, because it was noticed that by fixing the NGNREGA wage rate at the state prevalent minimum wages, or sometimes there would have the tendency to revise the minimum wages in a manner which may not have been very justifiable. So that's also kind of an artificial inflation of wages. And just because the work was being funded by the central government, there was this temptation to inflate the wage rates. But by pegging it at the consumer price index, there is a more scientific way out to balance the wages. So that's a sort of a design thinking in a very innovative manner. The next set of questions is also related to wages, and that's question number 5, which was how to enable the worker to earn the NGNREGA wage rate. And the problem here was that there are 2 ways of measuring the wages. One is against time of work done in 7 hours. But if you were to take only a time scale, then they could slow down the work or even lead to no work. And if you just pay somebody for being around for 7 hours on a work site but not measure the work being done, then the result could be no output, and the whole NGNREGA wage would just be a dole handout. And in that case, if no hard manual labor, which was a qualifying selecting criteria inbuilt into the policy design, if that were to be diluted by simply allowing the hours of work to determine the wage rate, then the lazy rich could hijack the program and the poor would remain in a poverty trap. The other measurement would be the task measurement. So you could look at the work done within 7 hours, but then in that case, the social protection aspect of NGNREGA could get diluted, because there are different abilities according to age and gender. And then only the very strong or the very able would be able to work, and they might perhaps not need the work quite as much as those who are older, or perhaps women who are not able to travel to a great distance to seek work. So then the wage differential might impact those who need the work the most. And please remember, we said even in the categories of poor, there are categories of those who are more needy than the others. So the problem here was, how do you address these 2 measurements, only by time or by task? And there was an existing schedule of rates to measure work, but this is really based on the use of machines. And if you make a schedule of rate for work being done by manual labor based on machines, then you'll have a very unrealistic output, and that is not possible through manual labor. So the whole design would get disturbed. And the design thinking has come up with the design innovation of preparing the schedule of rates done on what we call studies, so different tasks in different regions for different abilities and ages and gender. And this is called time, work, and motion study. And this is also a form of procedural instrumentation, because it's a causal sequence of activities leading to a certain result. And the new schedule of rates that states were asked to formulate would then reflect the average work done for different work types, for different abilities, age, or gender, And then the rates would be based on these averages, which would be based on empirical studies. So this is again a very complex design example. And then the expected task outcome would be calculated and be made commensurate to the wage rate. So this is again an example of the result of a policy on the ground, a practice which induced a design reiteration to make the design fit better with the client. Design question 6 is also related to the wages, and how can leakages and delays in wage payment be eliminated? The problems here were the fact that there were leakages in cash payment, and there were also delays in paying the wages. So here again we have an example of design thinking, and it comprised of separating the payment agency from the implementing agency, and also eliminating hand-to-hand cash transfer at the local level. So here we combine an institutional arrangement and technology-created design innovation. The act itself was amended, and that made wage payments through the institutional accounts mandatory, and accounts were opened to workers with a zero balance, and also in post offices, and then technology was used to make an F transfer into the workers' accounts. This is also an example of procedural instrumentation, and has been also an example of practice looping back in a design reiteration to make the design solution better fit the client. So this design intervention proved to be transformational because changes in just the way of doing business produced not only immediate results, but also triggered off a series of unintended gains. So this turned out to be the largest financial inclusion program of the poor, because about 30.5 crore accounts were opened. And that was a big leap because these were all zero balance accounts, and a lot of negotiation had to be undertaken with banks at that point of time. But there's also nudged gender empowerment, because there are like 10 crore joint accounts of women, and having access to your wage earning and also having control over the choice of how to spend that earning, this is a huge step towards women's empowerment. Please notice the design of the policy here. So this is a design for the inclusion of the poor. The inclusion is first of all in terms of work, but then also in terms of financial inclusion, like financial services. Please recall policy typologies. There is the economic sector policies have development policies and financial services policies. And social protection is a further subset of development policies. And all of them come together in a very elegant, simple way by simply nudging banks to open zero balance bank accounts for the poor and ensuring that their wage earnings are transferred into them by the use of technology, the F transfers. And then having joint accounts in the name of women enables their access to the earnings. This is a really very beautiful and very transformational design and an innovation, because this is triggering out very significant behavioral changes. The following questions now relate to works, and the key design problem here is to bring together social protection and livelihood resources. I mean, social protection can just begin and end with a cash transfer and may not very much bother about the results, other than the fact that the poor have now access to some resource that helps them survive. But looking at livelihood resources also looks beyond immediate social protection. If you recall the diagram or the framework of resilience, where we said that the immediate level of is one of protection, of resilience is one of protection, so which can be like a social safety net. It just helps you deal with your current crisis. But a step ahead of that in that resilience framework is not just protective but also promotive and also preventive. I mean, if you strengthen your very base of livelihood, then you're able to earn better, and in doing so you might depend less on social protection interventions. So not only do you have resources given to you through a social protection program, but you also are able to create and generate your own resources to deal with crises. So that's a higher level of resilience. You move from protective to may be preventive and then promotive of even more resilience. And that we referred to earlier as a substantive instrumentation, because that was the very definition of the inclusive design of NREGA. But then how is that design intent to be actually translated into a set of activities and be materialized in the real world, away from a policy document or just design thought? So here's how this goes: by creating a work typology essentially focused on this natural resource management. Please remember that these are agriculture-related communities, they're agricultural laborers or small and marginal farmers, and the livelihood resource base is actually natural resources. And these, in the earlier slide on problem definition or problem mapping, was included the fact that the natural resources are eroding on account of climate change and other extreme events. And that is one of the reasons why the poor are trapped in a vicious cycle of dependencies that makes them vulnerable. So the way design question 7 is formulated in the Act through these steps of designing works is very critical to solving that problem at its very root. I mean, not just give, through social protection, you give them a cash transfer to deal with their situation in the current context. But by focusing on natural resource regeneration, you're also strengthening on a long-term basis the very livelihood resource base, and that will give them access to future employment opportunities which are less dependent on the government and which they can, through their own effort, create and produce. So that's also a pathway to greater self-reliance, and that's a very high form of resilience. And so here we look at these 4 categories, something like a work typology. They're all centered around natural resources, but some of them can be taken up on public land. That is very important because that's a shareable resource, like water conservation, a public tank, or land development, land leveling. Then there are works that can be taken up on individual lands of specified categories. Please keep remembering the importance of creating categories, because it helps you fine-tune your instruments and make them more precisely related to your solution and to your client. So here these are individual lands which are held by below poverty line farmers. So that means that you're looking at a large stock of rural community, but within that you're looking at those who are below the poverty line. That means the ones who need the most, who need this kind of work the most. And then you look at, then there are beneficiaries of land reforms and scheduled caste and scheduled tribe groups also. So if they have land in their name, then activities of NREGA can be taken up on their land. For example, horticulture or farm forestry. And there's also a very interesting combination of individual entrepreneurship, and you work in your own land, so you put in a lot of effort. That gives you motivation because you will enjoy the fruits very directly. So you work, you earn the wage, and you also earn the fruit of the work that you create. It's also a very good twinning combination. Different benefits nest together. The third category, or category C, is a promotion of self-help group livelihoods, like livestock or fisheries. So here again, you're looking at not just promoting natural resources or not just implementing a social protection program. You're adding a third dimension, that of being able to organize the rural poor into something like entrepreneurial groups, collectivities that can multiply individual efforts. So it's also a very interesting design instrument here, because you're adding the factor of collectivity and thrift and saving to economic enterprise, which itself is being generated from a social protection program. And they're also being able to link the twin goals of ecology and economy, while keeping the focus very squarely on equity. Then we have category D work, which is rural infrastructure, like houses or roads. These have been very useful as well. And infrastructure is very important also for moving goods from the farm to the market, and vice versa, moving investments and inputs back from the market into your farm. And that augments productivity. Please recall that declining agriculture production was one of the main causes for vulnerability and deprivation, especially among the agricultural labor. So if you improve farm productivity, you augment the employment chances the agricultural labor has. Maintenance of rural public assets have also been allowed under NREGA, and this has been a huge bit of design thinking, because actually every government policy creates assets, but very few remember to provide for their maintenance. So it becomes like wasted investments over a time period. We have to remember that all public policy designs operate in continuums of time, so that can either lead to gains or can start degrading themselves. And a lot of public assets follow the path, end up just getting destroyed through neglect. So by providing for maintenance of rural public assets, NREGA makes a huge leap and actually benefits so many other programs and their assets. Design question 8 is, how can manual labor create durable assets and augment productivity? So this is a continuation of question 7, because we're still looking at finding the right kind of a fit within the design instrument between manual labor and the goals of productivity and durability and better livelihood resource base. So here the question is, because it's manual labor, so how do you create a strong asset that lasts in time? Please remember we spoke about the fact that the results of public policy are to be tested in time. The design solution here again is a procedural instrumentation and quite innovative. It looks at balancing the wages and materials ratio in a work as 60 and 40, and that's what you call a bifocal lens, because the employment activity creates the work and generates wages. So that's how you can actually continue to be a social protection program and transfer wages to the worker. But that 40% is to be used for materials and semi-skilled workers, and that opens up the opportunity of jobs for skilled manpower. And this means that village level masons and carpenters and brick makers, they can also find jobs here. And that's a very inclusive design. And I keep repeating the word inclusive because as we move through an analysis of NREGA design, we are compelled to remark upon how inclusive that design turns out to be by very, very simple design elements. Simply 60-40 waste material ratio allows so many skilled persons who may not want to do manual labor, but would actually not be averse to joining up another 40% component for materials and semi-skilled work. And this way, NREGA has contributed to the employability of more persons than just the unskilled manual labor. And then the other way in which this question has been handled is through trying to build capacity of these workers. A lot of people have been employed as supervisory mates for work fields, for work sites, and as engineers and village assistants, and they all require training. So design prototypes of labor-intensive works focused on NRM, or National Resource Management, have been created. And this huge cadre of workers taken up to manage the program at the village level have been trained on these. And they also, by creating design prototypes, you also bring in a norm, a technically sound norm, a standard, and that has proved to be useful in ensuring that the work that is being done adheres to certain levels and certain of quality. A third interesting way in which manual labor has been used to create durable assets which are also productive is through convergence of different works, so that larger benefits can accrue. And this is really an innovation because it forges new relationships, and by uncovering synergies between resources and activities and technologies, and so value is added without necessarily escalating costs. And you can a very simple example of spatial convergence by having a farm pond. You can build into that many other inputs like pisciculture or irrigation or contour budding or agroforestry, and then poultry, so you will have water conservation and increase in crop yield and diversification of activities and more income generation. So all these are examples how Complex and large results don't necessarily need complex and large designs, but a good design is one which is simple and to use, simple in understanding, and in this case does not require a huge amount of skill to be executed because the target group is unskilled manual labor. We look at further design innovations that seek to answer the question how can manual labor create durable assets. And the design solutions continue to be in the nature of procedural instrumentation. So this is just so that we are able to link our theoretical framework with the actual case study and how that actually works out when designing a policy. So some very interesting use of technology have been the standardization of estimates on the design prototypes and creating design softwares that can be used on very simple semi-smart mobiles, so that this huge far-flung cadre of barefoot engineers and local youth working on the work sites as mates can actually have more accurate estimates when they plan for works with better costs and generally better design. So this can be a huge space for designers interested in this kind of work. Of matching technology with solving a real world problem that actually impacts very poor people, and of transferring skilled exercises to a large community of only semi-skilled people. So these are huge transformational and design innovations that leap kind of do a historical leap because they move skills and technologies very quickly down to where they're needed the most and at very frugal costs. Then planning and creating planning maps based on satellite maps and satellite imagery and GIS softwares. These are also some very interesting design innovations that seek to improve the quality of planning, more accurate planning. I mean, remember, design and policy is always concerned about improving the accuracy because it works through approximation on account of the large scale and the diversity of issues on that large scale. Because you have to use better and better instruments to have more and more precise and more accurate reach. Technology is a huge instrument in this. So by creating GIS maps and using satellite imagery, you can actually do far more accurate planning on what work should be taken up where is there a drought, where is there water logging, what kind of ground terrain is that, and that can help you make more informed and better choices in deciding what kind of NGNREGA category of work ought one to take up. Vulnerability mapping with appropriate works. This is very important because a vulnerability map is a very important tool for problem statement and solution. What it does is that it helps to profile vulnerable communities in terms of their social, economic, and physical parameters, and it helps you to do environmental assessments and the spatial planning on what kind of an intervention is best suited for what kind of a vulnerability, whether it's in social term, economic term, or a physical term. I mean, whether you're looking at the vulnerability in terms of the environment, I mean, it's a drought-prone area, or in terms of the community itself, I mean, they are poor people, or you're looking at it in terms of the overall geographical feature of that place. And you can have a whole series of vulnerability indices, and a lot of research goes into that. This itself is a very important design research tool which helps in better assessment of the client, the problem, and therefore helps in making a more robust design solution. And there are different methods for vulnerability mapping. It can be quite rigorously scientific at one level and be very creatively ethnographic at the other, and the need is to bring them both together. And we have an example of how actually on the work site this whole dilemma of matching labor-intensive work with durable and productive assets was resolved by a very clever improvisation. I call it a design improvisation because this was done very specifically locally at one worksite, and was a quick response to a situational problem. Shows design thinking on the feet by the officer in charge of the district Jalore, the district collector there then. And his problem was that was very low work output and so low wages, and the men neither worked nor allowed other men or women to work. So they were the idle workers pulling down work and wages. The whole group dynamics on that work site was very negative. The design thinking here targeted breaking male hegemony as a task and to bring in greater transparency in the work executed through peer pressure. And this was done through design improvisation. This was quite interesting because women were brought in as mates, and this is an area where culturally male hegemony is a very important determinant on what women should do and how. But because of the support of the government, the women were given the task as mates. Mates are worksite supervisors to supervise the work. Then they were trained in work measurement using simple arithmetic formulae and handling calculators with caps and diaries, and that made them look like a team of skilled professional workers, and they were just simple women who were probably subordinated by both the cultural male patriarchy and also not being allowed to work to their full potential. But this was a kind of a liberation for them. Their roles were changed, and by changing those roles and by changing their skill sets, they transformed the whole performance on work sites. This is also aided by forming workers in a small group so that there was more transparency in the way the work was executed. You could actually measure individual outcome. And that also created peer pressure because of the idle workers were very easily spotted then. This was a very interesting design improvisation. It was also recommended for the National Award. And it got the National Award for NGNREGA. And the impact, again, very simple changes. Getting women to work, forming small groups, calculators, simple arithmetic, very, very simple, don't cost anything at all. But they had a huge impact. Led to better worksite supervision, increased labor productivity, wages went up, and this was, of course, an example of gender empowerment. Women were were in roles of authority, and that itself is a transformational nudge in terms of gender equity. It's also interesting to see how a concern for different kinds of equities, equity in wage, equity in work, equity in gender, all if they are designed well and nest with each other, actually create multiplier results of increasing positive impact of each one of them. And that's what actually leads to transformational behavior, when you are able to multiply gains, layered on each other. Another very interesting example of design innovation to address the question of using labor-intensive work for lasting and durable assets and for improving productivity was the work taken up in Sikkim to revive traditional springs. The problem statement here was that there was erratic rain and the water would run off and the springs would be dry. And because of decreasing groundwater, the women were hit the hardest. So again, you see how repeatedly questions of poverty and hardship related thereby always have an impact on the status of women and on gender issues in general. And NGNREGA is a very good example of how it's layered thinking, layered in terms of looking at different forms of inequality, looking at different forms of resilience, and compacting them together in very simple work designs have actually helped to bring about better results for those who are probably hit the hardest by that form of deprivation or scarcity. So the women were hit the hardest because of the access to water, and the problem statement was to enhance the contribution. The problem statement was that because of this decline in rainfall, how do you regenerate the springs in Sikkim, the traditional springs? And the solution was a program called Dharavikas, whereby you created an artificial system of regenerating the springs. by catching the surface runoff water and then using it to recharge groundwater sources. And this was done by using staggered contour trenches and percolation pits. You see, again, very simple, unskilled manual labor, but very skilled design thinking behind that. And that is the beauty of NREGA. There is a fair level of sophistication in the thinking that guides the work or guides an effective practice. But the work in itself can be reasonably simple to execute. And this led to the creation of about 700 springs and an environmental isotopic fingerprinting study of springs and skim as well, in collaboration with BARC. And that's a huge amount of sophisticated knowledge being created, but which at the interface level has a very simple, simple design to it. The study done by ISC in 2013 showed that this was successful in terms of increased irrigation productivity, increased motivation, etc. But the point again to be repeated here is that you can have transformational results, and the design for that can be kept as pretty frugal and pretty simple. So climate concerns were not part of the original NREGA design. I mean, they were not part of the discourse of the NREGA. But there was an early study undertaken by ISC Bangalore, and that highlighted the climate adaptation and mitigation impact of NREGA. And more importantly, what the study highlighted again was the design thinking and identifying methods of works that are guided by a concern for natural resource regeneration, and that made NREGA automatically a mechanism for climate adaptation and mitigation. Again, the same point that the work design is simple in concept and use, but has potential for multiplier benefits. The study done by ISC Bangalore is available on the NREGA website, and you can go through that to see how the various climate adaptation impacts that NREGA works have. This led to further design thinking. And once you realize that there is a potential, it makes you think about it, and that's how design thinking is a pervasive and an intensifying activity. So here the design thinking was how to consciously infuse climate considerations into NREGA works and planning to make them climate resilient, and this led to further design innovation. Here is one example of design innovation in terms of introducing the principle of climate resilience for works planning and execution. And here the task is apparently very simple: how to recharge the traditional water channels for floodwater in Bihar known as ahar pines that have got silted. And so the water is not flowing down like an irrigation stream anymore, and in fact is drying up and clogging. So there's silt forming, and there's reduced groundwater, and all of that affects agriculture. So by using climate principles of climate resilient thinking here, the effort has been to do vulnerability mapping and then to match those areas which are vulnerable in terms of poverty or biophysical parameters like groundwater availability or exposure as in terms of drought, and then help the planners to prioritize works that they can take up. You see that here in a nice map, because you have the assessment of vulnerability and then you have the prioritization of works in NREGA by using a scientific principle, or what we can call a climate resilient engineering design. And that integrates natural resources and then converges. So we continue with the principle of convergence, but we also make sure that the technical treatment of all the design elements here are well integrated to make this a climate resilient structure. So these series of examples related to design questions pertaining to works in NREGA and the challenges therein of matching labor-intensive work with durable assets, the challenge of combining social protection programs with progressive layers of resilience, have a set of lessons to yield to us, and just wanted to summarize that here. One of them is that design research in a policy can be sustained by a continuous probing of the of what is happening on the ground. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be formulated right at the beginning of policy. I mean, to have like a baseline or a predetermined set of postulates with a predetermined set of instruments, but it can emerge by reflecting on the way the design solution is opening or is unfolding. And the whole research into the climate potential of NREGA is an example of that. Then, just to summarize the three issues that emerged from a discussion on the design of works in NREGA, I'm sorry for the repetition, but one of them really is that complex concepts can be designed in forms that are simple and easy to use, but can have potential for multiplier benefits. And that's very important because costs and frugal use of resources are very important, what we call cost efficient. That's a very important factor for design. Everybody can have a grand design, perhaps, if there is no limit to resources. But the question would really be, do you need that? So an optimal use of resources and an efficient use of resources is very important for sustained designing and also for a more impactful designing, because you're not wasting resources, and because you're not wasting resources, you're a lot more focused and in your, in how you're targeting and looking for more and more and better fitting solutions. Then conflict and debate can open pathways to design research. The whole research into the climate potential of NREGA arose because there were these huge misgivings about whether NREGA works were benefiting anyone at all in the beginning when the program was first launched. And one way of meeting that was to get research done to see whether simple tasks like desilting, just turning the earth just turning the soil like an earthworm, I mean, does that have any benefit at all? Or is it simply, tossing the soil from one end to the other, as was then alleged? And by confronting these kind of misgivings or these kind of differences in opinions and engaging with the debate can open pathways to sustainable solutions, because they deepen your understanding of the problem and they open your mind up to more feasible solutions. And that also opens up the pathway to more design innovation. So the whole scope of design solutions starts to enlarge. And that's by burrowing through the debates and the conflicts, not by shutting down or defending yourself without having sufficient ground for defense. So open engagements is a good process of designing. In design as policy, though, I must admit that very often policymakers can appear to be evasive about such debates. But in NREGA, I was quite fortunate to be involved in this process of debate and discussion. And therefore, I wanted to make this statement up front here. This is a very useful hint to anybody who wants to design in policy or even design other ways, because it opens the mind up to more cognitive values. Then design as policy is a platform for collaborative design because it brings together stakeholders, government, local bodies, communities, professionals. So this again harks back to the point that design is a meta-design. The slides that now follow is the last segment of discussion on NREGA. We have looked at the integrated design of NREGA, wherein the worker wages come together in an integrated relationship to promote the goals of equity, ecology, and economy. But all this has to be managed on the ground through an institutional framework, and that's design management. We did say earlier that in design and policy, the design has to be managed by the designer. I mean, and let's say in outside the policy scope, if you just have a product design, then the designer's job ends with designing it, and the client has to manage the product design. But in policy, that's not the case. In policy, the product is the policy, and the policy has to be implemented, and the responsibility for implementing the policy lies with the government. So in policy parlance, we can call these issues as governance issues, and governance is through institutional frameworks. That's also a statement we made earlier in a theoretical framework, that design as policy needs an institutional framework for its transaction. There are two questions here. The first question is, how can a large-scale village-level program be managed? And the answer to that is through decentralization within a pyramidal hierarchy. And there's also an example of procedural instrumentation, because you have a causal sequence of activities that depend on multi-level relationships and on a hierarchy of subsystems here. So you have at the base the Gram Panchayat or the Gram Sabha. You have the base the Gram Sabha, as is the village community as a whole, and that sort of reports to or is sort of works with the Gram Panchayat, and then the Gram Panchayat works with the Janpad at the block level, and then the district level, and then the state government, and then the central government Ministry of Rural Development, and then the finance ministry that funds all of this. So that's the pyramid, and the worker is at the bottom as part of the Gram Sabha or the village community. So you can see that there is a sort of a hierarchical relationship here between the client or the worker at the bottom and the provisioning system, which sits in several levels and layers on top of the worker and are supposed to reach down to the worker. And now this is an instrument for enabling the demand to be responded to by the guaranteeing bodies beginning from the Gram Panchayat upwards. And we remember that slide we had earlier where the worker who's situated somewhere there in the Gram Sabha offers a work application to the Gram Panchayat, who can then very quickly respond to that. So this whole the idea of quick response hinges on a decentralized model of governance, and also because political ideology was very strongly in favor of strengthening the Panchayat Raj institutions when the Act was being designed. So both the combination of political ideology backing Panchayat Raj institutions and the idea that local matters are best handled locally supported the design solution of decentralization, but within a hierarchy. Now, why is this hierarchy important is not just the fact that it's a structural necessity, considering that the worker is down there at the bottom and everybody who's providing for the worker is really on top, but it's also important because there is this whole question of how to budget an open-ended work demand. I mean, workers can demand work whenever they want, any time of the year, right up to 100 days. So how does a government formulate a budget in anticipation of that demand? And different factors can affect the demand. So you need to have some system whereby you can have an assessment of the financial resources needed to sustain this kind of an open-ended guarantee. And the response to this was the idea of the labor budget, which is in the Act. The labor budget is a sort of a design innovation because what it asks is that at the local level, the Gram Sabha should, with the Gram Panchayat, formulate a labor budget which estimates the demand likely to come for work in a year to follow. Labor budget is like an annual exercise. And it should also cost, or what's the cost of the works and the wages to be paid for that employment to be meted out. And then that labor budget goes up, all the way up, and goes to the central ministry, and where the final view is taken by the Rural Development Department that consolidates, modifies, and agrees on a final budget outlay. And then that comes right down in terms of financial releases when the work season starts, or when the budget is finally approved and given to the Rural Development Department. Then they are in a position to announce that works can now be opened because there is a budget to support that. So this is how a decentralized program is managed within the hierarchy of the institutional framework. Another question here in MGNREGA was how to institute a watch over the program by the community, especially those who are participant workers. Design innovation here is through the social audit mechanism to be conducted by the client herself. I mean, so the client community itself should be keeping a watch over its works and the work of the government as well. And this is a kind of a participatory verification of records and processes, and with the, on the ground, I mean, in the field. So you match what's on record with what's on the ground, and you do this. I mean, this is being done with the Gram Sabha. Gram Sabha is the agency for social audit. Under the Act, they are supposed to be auditing the Gram Panchayat. And then because the Gram Sabha is really at the bottom of the whole hierarchy and therefore possibly not the most empowered body in reality. So there was a kind of a policy tweak here, and the social audit rules were amended, and a social audit unit was to be established at an arm's length from the state government and with outside experts who could then enable and empower the Gram Sabha with its skills and knowledge and the expertise of being an outside agency and not directly subordinate to the Gram Panchayat. And so with this kind of technical support, the social audit is supposed to be conducted. And here again is an instance of how subsystems and hierarchy, multi-systems, and a causal sequence of activities have to be very finely orchestrated as procedural instrumentation for a certain activity to be effective. Another question, importantly, for program management is how to track the program implementation and how to place information in public domain, considering this is large swathes of information and multi-tiered and really, like literally all over. So how do you track information of 70,000 crores of rupees going off to maybe 6 lakh panchayats and spread over something like 6 to 7 crore families and 10 crore workers, and then dispersed and scattered into small works all over the country. And here again, the design solution leveraged technology as design innovations through the web-enabled MIS, and this is a really good example of how the web MIS itself is an architecture and a virtual travel through the whole NREGA implementation scenario. You can drill down every unit, every bit of information can be disaggregated down to the unit and then be built up again. And this is a good example of how designing and policy can use technology very effectively. There are other examples of technology innovations that NREGA has looked, and again, a very important space for product designers and technology professionals. There are several feedback loops and through researches and studies and evaluations of what's happening on the ground that have looped back into policy redesign. We saw some examples of that during the discussion, like wage payment to the banks and social audits to external experts. So these were substantive changes in the Act and in the policy design itself. And then there are examples of program reviews, wherein the program guidelines are changed. And examples of this are like skilling of beneficiaries or convergence of resources. So this is how the whole NREGA design has been played out. We can summarize the kind of design types that have been subsumed in NREGA as an example of meta design. This was evident all through the discussion, but just to bring it all together, we notice how NREGA has created space for different kinds of design: products, infrastructure, technology, work systems, so on. So, the way framework of action, policy, act, program, rules, guidelines. This is design and policy in terms of how do you create frameworks for action. Then documents like job cards, which actually give identity to workers, or training manuals, or worksite mates' diaries. They're all examples of designing documents for different clientele. Then products, ergonomic baskets for head loads, barrows, tools for work, mud bricks, the kind of inputs into various agronomic practices being affected by NREGA. Then the communication systems between the designer or the state and the client, a targeted user, society in general, about the program as advocacy to influence perception, and communication back from society to the designer, critique and assessment of the policy and the program, using multimedia like print or internet or studies, surveys, research, including a whole stream of designing signs and logos, icons, films, posters, photographs. So it's been a very rich field for communication design. And of course, for infrastructure, prototypes of permissible works have been a very important area that involves professional designers of infrastructure, including climate resilient infrastructure. Then design for services like financial inclusion of the poor through bank accounts. There's also systems designing. And then design in the form of technologies. We already mentioned ID for MIS or GIS or or doing NRSA-based planning. Then systems, of course, very simple systems like IT systems, or more complex systems like market networks, which have to be designed if you want to nudge NREGA towards economic activities. And of course, the whole business of how do you do decentralized planning systems or governance systems as well. We can also very quickly recap the design innovations. So the whole host of them, and we have to remember that the innovations come in a historical context. So what may not appear like an innovation now was an innovation when it was introduced, like having wage payments of the rural poor through institutional accounts in a zero balance account, the use of technology to transfer wages through the NEF transfers, indexing wage rate with the CPI-AL, and then all the innovations that emerge and try to make the NREGA works more climate resilient. We here attempt to do a kind of a design appraisal, and one way to do design appraisal is to look at this context that was being addressed, or that was the at the genesis of the whole act. So what was we go back to the whole question of what was the kind of problem that was being addressed by NREGA. And against that, we can match what has actually been happening and what direction is that taking the whole policy. So one of the sources of data that's relevant in this design appraisal is the Socioeconomic Caste Census of the Government of India, SECC, 2011. This showed that 60%, or about nearly 11 crore of nearly 18 crore rural households, were deprived or poor. And of these, about 5.5 crores, or nearly 5.5 crores, that's about nearly 30% of the households, were landless labor, deriving a major part of their income from manual labor. And these are indicative of the numbers of rural poor households who could have been potential beneficiaries or clients of NREGA, or the targeted use of the work guarantee. Against this, if we look at the average numbers of families who availed of work under NREGA, we find that an average of about 5.5 crore per year. The matches well with that kind of figure of nearly 5.37 crore of landless labor. In the year 2021, this number of households rose significantly to 7.5 crores from the usual annual average of about 5.5 crores. But here there is a sort of a resonance of figures that show that possibly the landless labor, who were really the poorest of the poor, were possibly availing of work in NREGA. This is not the result of a detailed research, but simply a superficial juxtaposition of data as possibly indicative. And then one could conclude that perhaps the instrument of unskilled labor was conceived well by the designer or the state to provide employment to the rural poor, and that fitted well with the client. The potential users of NREGA could really have been around 10 crore private households, as surveyed by CCC. Notice the fact that in a year of need like 2021, with the COVID pandemic, with urban jobs being cut, the figure rose to almost 7.5 crores, by nearly 2 crores, despite all kind of problems. So that also suggests that this average of about 5 or 5.5 crore households working in NREGA is not really indicative of the full demand of work, but only that which can be absorbed under the Act, and that there could possibly be an unmet demand that NREGA is not able to respond to. We could look for an equivalent in a product design as a situation where the designer is not able to tap the full potential market for a product, not because the need for it does not exist, but because the product is made of materials that are in short supply. So these are the kind of figures I was referring to, where you have on an average of 5.5 crores and households, and this has been a sort of a ceiling of the number of households ever since the Act spread across the entire rural area of the country. And the average days of employment that have been availed of by each by each household working have stayed at about 48 to 50 days in a year, which is just about half of what the households could have availed of, because in a year they could have availed of 100 days of guaranteed labor. Then the total number of households that completed 100 days of employment, if you just look at the figure last year when the figure was relatively higher, or the one before that, it was relatively lower, has really been at around 40 lakhs, somewhere there. And that has really worked out as about 9.5% of the families that worked in NREGA. So if 10 crore deprived households could have availed of work in NREGA, the actual number has been an average of 50% of that 10 crore, spiking in a crisis like last year, but still far below. And that the number of days that the household could have availed of, according to the guarantee, has been at 50% of what could have been potentially available, or what was potentially available. And then the number of households availing of the 100-day guarantee is not really crossed 10% of the families that worked. The wage rates, the average wage rate per day per person, that has been on an increase because it was already linked with the consumer price index for agricultural labor, as we learned earlier, and the fact that almost 60% of the work's related to natural resource management. The budget for NREGA has surpassed any kind of a budgetary investment in a social protection program in the country ever historically. And that's a huge vindication of the rights-based approach, or the choice to use a legal instrument, a legal guarantee for work, notwithstanding the fact that the offtake of work has yet been only at about 50% of what is potentially available under the Act. To understand the reasons for this suboptimal utilization of benefits offered by the design solution, we have to remember that the capacity of the stakeholders is very important, and in particular the capacity of the client. In this case, the client is a rural poor. They do not really have the capacity for all the formal procedures to be able to apply for their full rights. And also, even if you tweak the design to make the state offer them work even when they can't apply formally, it actually ends up subverting the entire design intent. The design intent was that the workers should be able to assert their rights and demand work from the state, because otherwise the state may not be able to respond to the full need of the workers. And that was one of the problems in the earlier wage employment programs, that there were delaying funds and there were insufficient budgets to meet the full demand. And so the idea in the NREGA design was that the assertion of rights by the workers would in a way compel the government to respond to the full demand for work, the full demand being defined by a full 100 days guarantee as a kind of an upper limit in a year. But the capacity of the client to demand is affected not only by their fact that they're in the lowest base of a power hierarchy, where the provider of the solution is right on top. So they don't have much latitude in negotiating their terms with the state government or with the designer who's designed. So they're not able to wrest their rights from the state government and actually fully enjoy those 100 days of guaranteed work. And it kind of stops at 50% of that. So about 50% of households avail of 50% of work, and out of that only 10% households actually avail of the full 100 days. And this suboptimal use of the solution is because of the capacity of the client, both socially, economically, and in terms of power hierarchies. The capacity of the designer itself is limited here. I mean, the state has a limited fiscal capacity. It can't really provide for a full 100 days to every household, which could well be 10 crores if not more, who demand work. And so the fiscal capacity of the designer or the state government has actually curtailed the design solution from its optimal realization or use. Then the technical capacity of the designer has also affected the work, because we noted that there were limitations in the way the village level functionaries could actually plan or execute the NREGA works, and a lot of effort had to go into building capacity there. The capacity that has been built has resulted in some good works, but it still remains uneven among the various stakeholders. And that is why the quality of work in NREGA tends to be even now patchy. So we saw some very good examples of work, and that does validate the effort to build capacity. But it's also a testimony of the fact that capacity needs to be built. In other words, you're assuming that a system is fully equipped to deliver a design, but then in the process of doing so, you discover that the system is actually not so fully equipped. And we could understand this limitation by using a product design analogy. It's like using materials and technology that are still to be strengthened and have not been tested and are in an amorphous state. And yet they've been put to use, like trying to make a pot by a potter on a wheel that is still to be made, and the potter is still to learn his skill. This also highlights the importance of typology and taxonomy. The institutional design fails because it fails to balance different roles of different stakeholders and to segregate the regulatory from the promotive functions that the design envisaged. For example, social audit unit or the ombudsman for transparency and for redressal of grievances have actually been subordinated to the government that appoints and funds them. So that weakens their function as enforcement mechanisms. So there is a provision for a penalty for any violation of the Act, but that doesn't really get invoked because, one, there are multi-level systems, so it's very difficult to fix responsibility. I mean, how do you punish someone if the money hasn't come or the money is in short supply? And that obscures the whole design, because you cannot decide which is the factor responsible for the design not functioning. The second reason is that because the same agency is implementing and deciding, so then the deviating and the penalizing agencies both become same. And functions that ought to have been kept apart, the one that enforces and the one that implements, it's a very fundamental basic principle in policy. Well, they converge here, and that defeats the whole purpose of an enforcement mechanism. So the implications for policy taxonomy on policy design are very clear here. They help you to anticipate the consequences of institutional functionings. And that then it helps you to actually explore more precise instruments and to make for a more effective design. So not being able to understand how different components in an institutional framework work, how they relate to each other, has actually muted the whole idea of a legal guarantee where the government is forced to act in an accountable manner. So this will just show how the relationship between different instruments, sequential and multi-level subsystems, have to be coherent and consistent if the design has to function. But here we notice, on account of the limitations on the capacity of the client, the designer, and the confusion of roles of different levels and systems, has led to a situation where the guarantee itself snaps. So the rights of the workers are not able to compel the guarantee that was the whole focus of the design intent. You can see that graphically also, that the worker is right at the bottom and the demand gets suppressed because of so much intermediation, and that at the end the funding and the political will become the key determinants of how much benefit flows down to the beneficiary rather than the demand. So we can summarize the design processes involved in NREGA as being governed by normative goals, in this case for the Constitution and political ideologies, a context analysis drawn from surveys, and then analysis of existing policy designs from existing evaluation literature, a problem statement based again on national surveys and political agenda, and then design thinking, which sort of weaves its way from past experience to adapt to contemporary issues and shape the policy, a kind of a layering historical continuum. Then design thinking in formulating solutions to various design questions or identifying appropriate instruments, and a whole host of design innovations and improvisations to enhance the benefits or to reinforce problem solving efforts. We also saw how design research emerges in the process of thinking through the implementation on the ground, and in that process, how the boils of design keep getting pushed. Then we saw how practice loops back into review, and this itself becomes a stimulus for more design thinking and more designing more policies as well. In this last part, this is part 3 of the whole discussion, we try to take a quick look on some key takeaways from this whole effort to develop a theoretical framework for design as policy, then to apply that to a policy on the ground or an empirical case study, which was out of NREGA, and then see what insights emerge in this kind of a discussion, this kind of a comparison of a theoretical framework with an actual practice on the ground, an actual policy, which is a very important policy, not only in the country but internationally acclaimed as being a very unique social protection program based on rights and the right to work, especially. Actually, transferring rights to work to the poorest, and that has been hailed as a very transformational leap in a social protection program. Well, the first thing is that the object of design and policy is the human beings, and that the design articulates human values, so that's human-centeredness of design, and that it nudges social behavior towards desired goals. That's a normative function. And because of these reasons, the design outcomes are not mechanical results of stipulated procedures. There are intangibles like culture and personal perceptions of the user that can strongly influence the design outcome. Because your design object is a human being or human society, there are limits to experimentation that the design can indulge in. You have limited control over human behavior, then there are ethical norms that govern human behavior and interactions, and most importantly, the cost of making mistakes in design assumptions and designing would be irreparable. So what design actually in policy engages with is tireless tinkering of instruments, but that's bounded by ethical considerations. That would tend to make the design and policy a conservative approach. We use a word like transformational, but that does not suggest some kind of thoughtless, experimental, quantum jumps, as one might be able to make with, let's say, insentient materials. But when you're dealing with human destinies, then you have to have a more conservative approach. Conservative here does not mean something which is negative, but something which is guided and rational and evaluative and grounded in some past experience. Which has a historical knowledge as its repository of resources, and a set of sufficient analytical tools and resources to look beyond. So that's a conservative approach. It doesn't mean that you don't experiment, that you don't innovate, but you do that with a set of principles that are based on careful thinking through and evaluation of all possible outcomes. And of course, you're bounded by ethical norms. It also suggests that because of these reasons, a policy may perhaps stipulate minimum conditions for some kind of a design intent to take shape, and would look at client motivation as being very critical to an optimal use of policy. And that is important because that leaves options open for quicker modifications in the present as well as adaptation in the future, and an overall control of resources. So, the point being made here is that since you have a cautious approach to the way you're designing human society or human behavior, you can only stipulate some minimum factors and conditions that can promote client motivation towards behavioral change. And that's a good approach because it does retain control over your design. It should be imprudent to act otherwise. So prudence is an important principle in design and policy. Then negotiating conflicts is, we've already discussed, a very important part of policy making, and this is true for any kind of designing. We discussed that earlier, and that is also because there are different points of view on how the benefits are to be achieved, and then there are different interests, and they're impacted very unequally because people are at unequal levels, and there are differences in priorities. And a large part of design is negotiating these conflicts, both in policy and in product design, I would say. Then, one thing to remember also is that in policy, we design not just for, customize an individual benefit, but for the larger good, and that might well mean the sacrifice of the good of some for the sake of good of the others. I mean, that's what Lloyd described as redistributive policies, because somebody has to sacrifice for someone else to gain. And that is very intrinsic to policy design. Then design as policy is future looking. It has to look towards a time that is yet to come, but it's actually anchored both in the knowledge of the past and a concern for the present. And that makes the whole process of balancing what is and what ought to be and what can be a very delicate exercise. Again, that supports a cautious approach in policy, in designing. So COVID-19 is yet again an example of how policies seek to balance an action in the immediate present, but also try to anticipate a future, and then that's a very complex process altogether. Designing for sustainable development or climate action. These are also examples where you have to navigate an uncertain present landscape with an unknown and an unknowable future territory, and that makes all predictions somewhat imperfect. So you have to look for realizing an ideal state of society in very imperfect conditions, and that explains the very heart of tensions that inhabit design and policy. Then the fact that policies inhabit an ecosystem, whether they like it or not. So you can't ever say there are no oppositions between this is local and that is global, because chances are that all the levels are impacting each other mutually, constantly, even if people are not aware of it. So an ecosystem includes the macro context of global and national concerns, as well as local situational context very specific to a particular policy design. It's very important to understand and establish these intersectoral relationships, and these require very interdisciplinary perspectives, so that helps you make better instruments. And we saw that, for example, in the case of NREGA, if you have a pandemic, then that kind of spikes the demand up and demands greater fiscal commitments to the policy. And on the other hand, if there's a good harvesting season or good agriculture, then perhaps the demand for NREGA might be reduced. So none of these can be predicted with certitude, but the design must factor in their possibility, and that is why a good design ought to be having what Herbert Simon called future flexibility. That again argues for a careful in-between approach. I mean, you make a commitment, but you keep your options open. And that's very important. There's a certain amount of openness in a policy, while at the same time it can have a very conservative approach. So this is how you balance the possibility of things going wrong or things not going the way you expect them to go. And because the consequences of that can be very severe on human life, you have to have this sort of a flexibility when you design a policy. It's ironic that often policies are considered to be very rigid, but the important point to try to analyze is the fact that policies last for long times. I already made that point before, and they can only last for a long time with sort of tireless tinkering or tweaking at the program level, only if they have this balance between a certain amount of conservatism and at the same time a certain amount of willingness to be open and flexible. And that's pretty much linked with the fact that policies are influenced by political will. It's in the hand of political will to be able to do this kind of tweaking between what will be tread upon cautiously and carefully and what is it that we can take liberties and experiment with. This is actually a very interesting example of the elasticity in design. Then we of course noticed in NREGA how it's important to have a very clear idea of causality in whether it's in a linear sequential form or nonlinear as associated or multi-level systems. But nonetheless, the fact that the relationship between parts has to be coherent and mutually supportive is very clear when we saw how the institutional framework often suffered with a fair amount of confusion and in the way the parts ought to be relating to each other. Then I find that often a policy can be pushed to a certain level but will not go beyond that. And that's what I can sort of try to describe as a design aporia. Aporia really means an impasse, like a blind alley. That means that this particular policy design can only deliver to this particular limit, and beyond that, either there'll be kind of diminishing returns, or the policy will just fail to be able to respond to the problems at hand. And that's the point that's an indicator that there is a serious need to review the policy. This can take a historically long time, but this to be aware that every policy does serve a certain function, and when that function is no longer served by that policy, or the nature of the problem changes, or the environment surrounding a certain policy starts to change and modify to the extent that that policy no longer makes sense in the changed environment, then it's a design aporia. That means that you have to solve the problem in whatever form it now manifests itself by revisiting the policy design itself. Take, for example, the decision to privatize a service like civil aviation or nationalize private banks. And both are examples of change in design. The design paradigm, because it was felt that existing policy design no longer had the potential to solve the problem that they originally intended to solve. One more point I like to make here is the fact that policy is really an example of designing a discourse. A discourse articulates an ideal which may be in the real world, yet deadlocked by historical legacies of institutions, structures, and relationships. But notwithstanding that, the discourse signals the gap between established designs and preferred ones. I'll give you an example from MGNREGA itself. The language relates to rights for the poor. So there's a whole idea of legal demand and guarantee to that. And you can see a similar thrust to rights in the education sector with the idea of right to education. So in both these policies, the idea of development has been positioned like a human right, which is not only expressive of a normative value, but is also a change in the discourse in which fashions a particular policy. And notwithstanding again the fact that the language of rights may have had limited impact in actually influencing action towards a rights-based behavior, but it's a very important signal that seeks to nudge the perception of development away from some sort of discretionary benefit and towards the idea that development is a human right. So you can compare that with an expressive form in product design where you have a conceptual goal of right materials and methods, even if they do not at all exist in the ways desired. And that again becomes a whole field for design thinking, for innovation, for trying out new things and trying to work out new relationships between existing institutions. Finally, the point that there is a reciprocal relationship of design as policy and design in other forms. And this harks back to the original, the start of point that design as policy is really embedded design. But it's not just that design as policy subsumes all forms of design, but it's also that all forms of design have a very symbiotic relationship with policy as well. I mean, for example, the manner in which ID has influenced the very nature of governance and policy processes, the increasing use of graphic design to represent ideas that policymakers want to communicate that are great matters of concern. In fact, Bruno Latour had said that visualization tools are important because they allow the contradictory and controversial nature of matters of concern to be represented, and that there is a need for more designers to engage with that. But in the final analysis, having said all of this, there really is no substitution for good judgment. But then how does this good judgment arise? I mean, how do you have the capacity to intuitively decide what's right? And I think that intuitive faculty is the key to good designing, whether it's a policy or a product. And this itself is a result of experience and exposure to different fields of designing, and to enlarge the canvas of design, to train the mind to identify